Hello and welcome back to HEMAFight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be talking about the little armor test I did over last weekend. This was actually a video uploaded by my friend Tom, but I wanted to go over it a little bit because I wanted to illuminate a little bit of how it felt to do, why I did it, and what I might be doing in the future. So, as you can see, what the goal here was to test the Mordschlag against armor. Now, if you know anything about the Mordschlag or the Mordhau, you have probably heard that it is a tactic or a technique that knights would use to turn their longsword into a bit more of an anti-armor weapon. And I think the purpose of this test was to really disprove this in a lot of ways. The first problem with this technique is that there's already an anti-armor function of the longsword. That is, half-swording and stabbing into gaps. The idea that there's anything that you can do to that weapon to turn it into a kind of hammer or a pick so that you could harm somebody by simply swinging the reverse end of it hard enough always seemed a little far-fetched to me, but obviously not a lot of people have tested it. So, as you can see, every single time this thing hits my hand, I pretty much feel nothing. But one thing I want to make clear is that I did feel something. I did feel the impact. And what I want people to imagine is that, like, if you take your hand, you just kind of hold it out, and you just hit it with the bottom of your hand, you feel it, but it doesn't hurt. And what I want you to imagine is that that's what I'm feeling every single time this pommel hits my hand. And every single time this person swings a little bit harder, it does hit harder and I feel more impact. But the idea and the purpose of the test is to show that pretty much no matter how hard he swings, even when he gets a huge amount of backswing, he can't really reasonably deliver enough force through the plates to do anything other than inconvenience me. But there is something I want to point out right when we're talking about this, and that is obviously that I am holding out my hand in the air, and every time my hand gets hit, it's allowed to kind of dip down and move with the force. This is a realistic test for a lot of reasons, particularly because it's under ideal circumstances, and if you really want to see whether or not a Mordhau or a Mordschlag could ever do anything to you, you want to give it the best of every possible world, but you also don't want to put it in a situation that's completely unrealistic. Having my hand, for example, on a table or on some other kind of object that would not allow my hand to go through would really only tell you that theoretically you could hurt my hand if the bottom thing was also able to crunch my hand. You know, imagine like a hammer and an anvil situation where two objects meet, the thing in the middle gets completely squished. And I imagine that if I was holding an object like a sword or a pole arm or some kind of wooden shaft, it would probably have hurt a little bit more, but only on the bottom side of my hand. Obviously, the top side of my hand wouldn't have received any more damage or any more force, but as my hand was wanting to go downwards, it would have gotten in the way of the wooden shaft or the metal sword, and then the bottom part of my hand would have had to have received a similar sort of impact from that. So it's entirely possible that I might have been hurt if there was something in my hand, but technically the test was about whether or not the armor could take it, and so putting something in my hand didn't really make that any better of a test. The next thing I want to talk about is what happens at the very end, which is when this person tries to hit me with the crossguard. And I told them to try the crossguard because obviously if you look at the illustrations of the Mordhau, it's not always abundantly clear which part of the end of the sword you're going to be trying to hit with. Sometimes you see it bury crossguard deep into somebody's shoulder and you see, the illustration have a little blood come out. And sometimes it looks like you're swinging with the pommel. And I wanted to test the crossguard because I believe going into this that it would be a much better option than the pommel. Obviously, this turned out to be true. When the person swung at probably about half speed with the crossguard, I immediately felt a greater impact in my hand than anything I had felt up until that point. And what that tells me is that in a lot of ways, it's not about the amount of force that you generate, but it's about how small of a space you can put it into. I imagine that if we had, for whatever reason, sharpened the end of that crossguard into a little bit of a pick, it would have done significantly more damage to me and probably a little bit more to the armor as well. So right now it's looking like if you're going to think that a Mordschlag or a Mordhau is something that you want to try to do, you're going to want to test it with the crossguard and not the pommel. But that also presents another sort of problem, which is that aiming with the crossguard part is a lot harder than aiming with the pommel part. The pommel part is at the end of the object, so it's going to carry a little bit more force and a little bit more weight. You can't miss deep, you can only miss shallow. Which means that with the pick, you have to be very, very precise in order to put the thing exactly where you want it to go. Whereas with the pommel, you know, if you're a little bit too far, a little bit too deep, chances are you're still going to be right on target. And finally, the last thing and the last part of the video, I hold my hand up to the camera and you can see that for the most part, there's just scratches on my gauntlet. There's no dents, there's no dings, and there's certainly nothing that would prevent me from being able to articulate my hand. This is a myth that you hear about all the time, which is that if you use blunted weapons and you hit the joints of somebody in armor, it'll bend the lames, the little slivers of metal, and they won't be able to bend or articulate anymore. And besides the fact that there's no historical evidence that this is at all true, it's also pretty far-fetched to begin with, because the idea here is that these lames are somehow more vulnerable than other parts of the armor. And for certain instances, that's 100% true. Obviously, a lame is going to be more vulnerable to damage than, say, the breastplate. But what people don't realize is that oftentimes these lames are just as thick, if only a little bit less thick, as other parts of the armor. Maybe the helmet and the breastplate would be given a special emphasis on thickness, but pretty much the top of the arm or the shoulder or the upper arm is all going to more or less have the same thickness as, say, the gauntlet or the inside of the elbow, which means that there's really no increased ability to bend or break these plates as opposed to others. On top of that, lames have this thing that they're supposed to do, which is layer on top of each other, which in a lot of ways makes you think that actually there's less of an ability to bend or break a plate. As you can see by my own gauntlet here, there are sections where the plates overlap one another. And while theoretically, if you had the ability to puncture one plate, you might be able to do that on perhaps the end of my hand or the middle of my hand. If you hit a section where there were two plates overlapping, well, actually, you'd have a reduced ability to bend or break those plates. So the idea that you could maybe target a joint or a hand or some kind of inner arm area and bend a lame so that it wouldn't ever overlap just kind of falls apart on its face. However, I should point out that, of course, my armor is hardened steel. That means that it has been heat treated after it has been shaped. And what that means is it gives it a whole lot of great elasticity, it returns to its shape very quickly, but it does bend a little bit, which means that it has the ability to absorb and redirect force and not shatter, but also not redirect and move around so much that the force is allowed to go through to my hand. And this is a really, really good formula for making armor. However, of course, in history, not everyone's armor was made to that level. But again, when we're talking about testing purposes, what we have to remember is that you have to put things in their ideal circumstances. If you want to believe that somebody invented the Mordhau for the purposes of defeating armor, you'd have to be able to believe that it was capable of doing it in at least the overwhelming number of cases. If you're out on the battlefield and you try the Mordhau and it only works 50% of the time because only 50% of the people there have crappy enough armor that it works, you're probably not going to want to rely on it as a battlefield tactic. So we have to either believe that A, the Mordhau is just not effective against armor and it's something that somebody put into a text because they kind of thought it looked cool, or B, that enough armor on a battlefield was of low enough quality that this would have worked on an overwhelming enough number of cases that only a few people actually had good enough armor to withstand it, and most people you'd be fine. And in my opinion, that second option is significantly less likely than the first. What we know from looking at period historical sources is that most of the time, if you were an infantryman or something other than a full-on knight, you weren't even wearing full plate armor. And the reason you weren't is because A, it was significantly more expensive to put more plate on more parts of your body, but also B, it would be heavier and more cumbersome, and you were the one who had to walk around on your own feet. Meaning that if you were to swing a Mordhau at a person in infantryman's garb, well, there's actually plenty of places where you can just hit them with the sword part, and it would be pretty effective. Most people in half armor didn't armor their legs or their face, which means that there was pretty much always an unarmored area that you could target with pretty much any weapon and it would be effective. There isn't much of a reason to need or want a technique to break or harm someone wearing half armor when it involves something as complex as flipping your sword upside down and swinging it by the blade. So right there, the efficacy is already kind of out the window. And then more importantly, when you get to the people who were rich enough and perhaps important enough to wear full plate armor, you knew pretty much right then that they weren't going to cheap out on anything. Part of the point of wearing this great armor is that it's not only going to protect you, but it's a display of your wealth and power. And the wealthier and the more powerful you were, the more you put into your armor. Meaning that if you were rich enough and cool enough to have lames on your inner elbow to protect you, you wouldn't skimp out and make them out of crappy, poorly made mild steel. Unless, of course, for some reason you got scammed. So the idea that the Mordhau is some kind of weird use case already ran up against some poor kind of historical research when it came to the fact that in every sort of unarmored and armored contextual fighting, people are much, much, much more likely to tell you to stab into a gap, again, because no one's armor was good enough to cover everything. And then as you got into the later periods, there was no reason to try to do something like this because people's armor was good enough that it could take it wherever you had to throw it. So I'm going to go ahead and say that while I probably could do with a little bit more testing, especially with the crossguard, I'm going to go ahead and say that the Mordhau and the Mordschlag is on thin ice as far as usefulness. I would say that anyone who would try this in some kind of armored duel or battlefield scenario probably was already in a position where they could have won a number of more efficient ways. And maybe it was somebody who just was a little bored one day and decided to invent something super crazy. Or maybe they just wanted to put a really, really cool picture in their picture book that would tell other people, oh, hey, this guy's got this radical new way of dealing with armor. I'm going to go to his fencing school and learn from him. Whereas, he would never actually teach or use that technique. Either way, if you think I'm wrong, well, wait a little bit. I'll be doing more testing in the future, or write me a nice long paragraph. But if you want to see more stuff like this, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.